how Rachel finds her voice. And I think I made mention of this when we discussed Eicha, namely that I pointed out that the image of Tzion, the way Yirmiyahu renders her in the book of Eicha, is clearly inspired by none other than Rachel. And he makes reference to her in his writings, and we have that in some of the Haftarot. In fact, of all of the four matriarchs, including the two concubines, Zilpah and Bilhah, there's none that captured the imagination of both the Nevi'im as well as of the Midrashim, Midrashei Chazal, as much as Rachel. Perhaps because of the place of her burial, which stood alone, which may have seemed like she was spurned or rejected or set aside alone, but in fact allowed her to become revered almost to the degree that some see her as, if you like, the Jewish goddess. And you've got all kinds of writings to that effect. It's clear in the Tanakh, simply from reading the Pshat, that she emerges. And she emerges from this vulnerable but very pretty girl to somebody whose voice we do not hear until much later, at which point there is a tremendous amount of rage that comes out, until finally, if you like, she seems to be redeemed. And the redemption occurs at the time of her giving birth and then dying. And finally, as I said, through the words of Yirmiyahu, who was so inspired, given the fact that she's buried near Bethlehem, which is adjoining Anatot, which was his home place, and which, from that vantage point, you can actually see Har HaBayit, you can see the Temple Mount. There was a certain affinity to that. And throughout the ages, we've heard of people coming to, today, Alachat Kama Vekama, going to her tomb, crying. And Chazal tell us that she was buried there because that would become the root of the exile. And there, prior to going to Bavel, her children would stop and pray. There she would cry for them. And there God, of course, responds to her and does not respond, not to Avraham, not to Yitzchak, not to Yaakov, not to Moshe, not to Aaron, only to Rachel. He says, Mini kolech mi bechi, withhold from crying. Einayich midim'ah, veshavu banim ligvulam. I promise you your children will return. Since the return and the establishment of Medinat Yisrael, and certainly after 1967 when we got back, not only the Kotel, but back to Kever Rachel, though it doesn't look like anything in your paintings anymore. It has become, even some to say, occult-like. And the question is, why? So in order to do that, I would like to be able to see how she's first presented and how she metamorphizes to this incredible image. No one of all of the women in the book of Bereshit is given so extensive and what looks like a superfluous treatment. When she's first seen, we're told that Yaakov, of course, fled from home, knowing that his brother is intent on killing him. And ostensibly, for the sake of his father, he's going to Haran in order to find a wife there, an appropriate wife, because Yitzchak and Rivka are both disappointed in the choices that Esav has made. He's taken 2 Canaanite wives so far, and this is a disaster as far as they're concerned, violates Abraham's last will and testament, and therefore Esav has disqualified himself from being the continuation from Abraham to Yitzchak. And therefore they send him to Lavan, who's not exactly your paragon of virtue, but better than what we have nearby. And if nothing else, as you will remember, we had the same issue when Avraham sent Eliezer, we'll bring the girl here, presumably, and she'll be far away from her father. Well, that's not exactly what happened in this particular case. And what we're told here is how he first sees her. By the way, she's the only woman where we hear that a man actually fell in love with her before they are married. Vayisa Yaakov raglav vayelech arza bnei kedem. We're told how he comes there, and he, of course, approaches the Be'er. Now, Elchanan Samet wants us to understand that the Be'er, the well, is not simply the town square where you would find everybody and would be the center of the city where if you were finding directions or looking for somebody, you're likely to find them there, but that in fact it becomes an image. It becomes an image for femininity, for the source of life. And this Be'er, however, is stopped up, already foretelling as an omen that this woman is barren, and it's not going to be simple. And remember that he has to use superhuman strength to remove the rock from the Be'er, and he describes it in this way, as do many midrashim. But on the simple pshat, look at what happens. As he's asking the shepherds that are there, all suspicious people, if they know where Lavan, who is Lavan, and they very, very mealy-mouthed. Yeah, we know him. And you're not hearing too much. Where would he live and so on. And they're giving virtually no information. They're monosyllabic in their answers. Odeno medaber imam, as he was talking to these shepherds there. Verachel ba'a im hatzon asher leavia. When lo and behold appears Rachel. Kiro'ahi, for she's a shepherdess. Okay, we got that point. Vayhi, now, Vayhi kasher ra'a Yaakov et Rachel. And when Yaakov sees Rachel, bat Lavan. Now, you were just told who Rachel is. So you don't need to hear again that she's the daughter of Lavan. And in case you're suffering from serious amnesia, Achi imo, his mother's brother. Ve'etzon Lavan, Achi imo. And the sheep that belongs to Lavan. And again, in case you forgot, Lavan, his mother's brother, his uncle. Vayigash Yaakov. And Yaakov, in this moment of, if you like, passion, with the adrenaline flowing, Vayigal et ha'even me'al pi ha'be'er, he moved that rock, which all of the other shepherds did not succeed in doing on their own. Vayashk etzon Lavan achi imo, and made sure that she would not have to wait her turn, and brought water to the sheep that belongs to Lavan achi imo. In one verse, 3 times, and all of them, even the first time, unnecessarily telling you, Lavan achi imo. Lavan achi imo. But you're told specifically, Vayi kasher ra'a Yaakov et Rachel. When he saw Rachel, says Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, how can you miss it? The familial resemblance was there. This man had been running, and according to Chazal, took a foray in between for a number of years to Yeshivat Shem Va'evel. So this is not just a few months ago. It's been quite a while since he's been home. And he can't go home. His mother told him, don't come home until I call for you. He can't go home again. His brother has sworn that he would kill him. And he was sent on a mission to go to Lavan to find a wife there. But when he sees her, what he sees, and that's why that mantra, achi imo, achi imo, achi imo, is that he sees the resemblance to his mother. And therefore, explains Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, the next line, that MGM gets it all wrong. Vayishak Yaakov leRachel. And so he kissed her. Now, the Ibn Ezra wants to make it clear that he kissed her as cousins would kiss. Hence the term kissing cousins. That's where it comes from. And he says it wouldn't be on the mouth because that would be nishika, vayinashek. Right? Minishikot pihu. but rather as appropriate, on one cheek or on the shoulder or on the hand, depending on where you come from. Where people once behaved in a gallant manner and they weren't so afraid about what the neighbors will say if he's firm enough or not. But then came the next part. Vayisa et kolo vayefk. And he raised his voice and broke out crying. Boy, that would really flop in Hollywood, wouldn't it? Why the crying? Well, Chassidim would say he kissed her spontaneously, and a moment later he cried because he shouldn't have. But not so others, because if you understand what motivated this, Rashi on the spot says he saw her and he had a vision. And that vision is that she would not be buried with him, that her life was short, that there was something that he knew prophetically about her, and so that he'd actually seen something. And that seeing at that moment when he kissed her was why he cried. He loved her, indeed. He fell in love with her, but a completely different sense of it. And what happens then is, Vayaged Yaakov lerachel ki achi aviahu. And only then does he introduce himself. Now, Ibn Ezra has a hard time with understanding that this girl would allow herself to be kissed, much less, you understand, and then this guy is crying. And only then is he introducing himself. He says, no, you've got to switch this around. First he introduces himself, and then, of course, he kissed her. But that's not what the Torah tells us. And the tenses don't support that position. But rather a spontaneous act, followed by an introduction. You can imagine how she feels, but you're not told a word. Instead, you're told, it says that he is related to her father and that he is the son of Rivka. Vataretz vataged leavia, and she fled and told her father. Rashi on the spot says the natural thing to do was to run home and tell your mother. And the Ramban here immediately points out, what is a young girl doing out there herding sheep and standing there with the other shepherds who are not letting her get to the water, opening herself, if you like, to this abuse? Explains he that she's the younger, some say they were twins, but she's the younger one of them. And her father, frankly, has put her to work. Why? Because her mother is no longer alive to protect her. Leah, on the other hand, is of marriageable age, so he doesn't want her to be violated. Rachel, if that's the case, is no account. And her father uses her and abuses her. She runs home to her father. You will hear that later on. And what happens is of course, Lavan comes and hugs him, and you know the rest of the story. So Shonyana gives lechta, right? He hugs him, you'll live with me, I'll take care of you. But we all know that that was highly conditional. And he essentially turned Yaakov into an indentured servant. Given the fact that he fell in love with her, we're told as follows, Ve'enei Leah rakot. Leah's eyes were, and the word rach means soft. Soft. The Medrash tells us that she had been intended for Esav, who was firstborn, and she was firstborn, and found out that he was a terrific rasha, didn't want to marry him. And she cried her eyes out until she lost all of her eyelashes. And therefore there was nothing to define them, hence that softness. But Rachel, on the other hand, hayta yifat toar v'yifat mar'eh. In all of Bereshit, no one is described with both of those except her son, Yosef. Yifat toar and yifat mar'eh. To Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, yifat toar is the external beauty, but the mar'eh is not merely that her eyes are beautiful, but that she has what we would call charm, chen. And so her ability to see, we have the notion of tov roi, or somebody that has an ayin tova, somebody who seems to elicit from others their affection, somebody who also sees the best in others. And she had this kind of chen that came from within, because the eyes were supposed to be the window to the soul. Vayeav Yaakov et Rachel, and he loved her. You're not told that initially, you're told this, and he tells his uncle, Evdecha sheva shanim berachel bitcha ktana. From here comes that very famous thing that when you specify things and you had everything on the dotted line and somebody nevertheless violates it. Berachel bitcha ktana. I want Rachel, and not only any Rachel, don't get me any other Rachel, Rachel your daughter. And which one? I want to be very specific. He knew who he was dealing with, and nevertheless he is duped. And of course, you know what happens. He works for her for 7 years, and we're told, Vayavod Yaakov berachel sheva shanim, vayu beinav kiyamim achadim. Those 7 years were like just a few days. Now, frankly, if you want something really badly, 7 years would seem like 7 millennia, not 7 days. However, if the amount that he needs to work is how much he esteems her, what he thinks her value is, what her bride's money is, then to him 7 years was not nearly enough. To him 7 years. So this is not merely about physical passion that demands to be satisfied immediately, impulsively and compulsively. This is about a love that comes from incredible esteem, but you haven't yet heard why. And you have no idea. It seems to be quite unconditional. And his uncle's response is, Tov titi mit ota lecha mititi ota li ish acher. Well, I may as well give it to you instead of to somebody else. It's almost as if you're no big yichus. You know, well, you're just as good as the rest of them. I don't care. All right, you can live here. And he worked there, as we said, for 7 years. At the end of 7 years, the manner in which Yaakov speaks to Lavan is incredibly vulgar. But I think that there is a concept called that im ikesh titpatal. When you're dealing with somebody like that, you got to talk his language. And he tells him, Havai tishti, give me my wife. Which would imply that though the 7 years were over, he was already finagling. It's my time. Give her to me. And so he gathers everybody together and we make a big party. Vayhi ba'erev, come evening. Instead, he switches. When there's no lights on, you need to understand you don't have the light pollution that you have nowadays. And he switches the two of them and he sleeps with Leah instead of Rachel. And what we're told, come morning, Vihine zu Leah, it was Leah. How could he be so duped? Chazal tell us that Rachel knew that her father was likely to do this. And as a result, the two of them had come up with some code words. The Medrash goes even further and says during that night, he called Rachel, Rachel, and Leah responded accordingly. Another Medrash even says it, that Rachel is under the bed, talking for her sister. And Rachel, throughout all of this, whether she is going along with this absolute cheat, or whether she is silent through all of this. Chazal tell us that in the morning he confronts Leah and says, what did you do? How could you trick me? And she says, trick you? Who did the tricking? She says, seems to me I could have learned it from the master, given the fact that he had tricked his father. She says, didn't your father call, is it you, my son, Esav, and didn't you pretend to be Esav and responded in kind, I did the same. And Lavan, when he is confronted, comes back and tells him, oh, we don't do this kind of thing of switching the older for the younger. You understand? That's not the way we do things around here. Very much pointedly stabbing at him as if maybe you do it where you come from, but we don't do things around here. But I'll tell you what he says. Just wait for this week, hence the source for Sheva Brachot. And at the end of this week, I'll give you the other one, but I'll give it to you on credit. So he married her 7 days later, without a party, without a wedding. The wedding that was hers became Leah's. She's taken as the second wife. And in the language of the Tanakh, that's called tzara. Tzara from the language of narrow, and from which comes the word tzuros. And now we have tzuros. Now we've got serious tzuros. And during this period of time, he is indentured to work an additional 7 years. 14 years later, his checkbook is 0. And he now has a large family. And Yaakov will be compelled again to work another 7 years so that he can finally earn enough to be able to have enough to support his own family. But what happens betwixt and between is that the beloved Rachel, the one that kept her mouth shut, that one that would not see her sister embarrassed. Now let me explain to you why she gave those signs according to Chazal. What would happen if in the bedroom he would have found out that it was Leah? He would have thrown her out. In that culture, what would that have meant? In that culture, a bride that is rejected is most probably not a virgin and brings shame to her family's house. What do they do to a woman who brings shame to her father's house? It is incumbent upon her father, and if not upon her father, then upon her brothers, to kill her. Rachel was not going to do that to her sister. And as a result, she shares her husband. She shares this love, and meanwhile becomes the person who is clearly barren. Leah has one son, Reuven, and that's when we hear her voice for the first time. And she says, God saw that I am despised. She has another son, Shimon, and she calls him Shimon ki shama Hashem, ki snoa anochi. God heard. Now, if God heard, then she also heard, as the walls were changing, that somebody hates her. It's not specified who hates her, but it's clear that Yaakov has no love for her, and it's conceivable that her sister's love has turned also into hatred, given the fact that she's having babies and she is not. A third child is born, and this time she says, Aha, apam yelaveni ishi. This time my man will escort me. And the Menos HaLevi says it's very simple. She only has 2 hands. There's one baby and there's another baby, and somebody has to push the buggy. So now when they go for their after chont spatzio, it's Yaakov walking next to Leah, and who's walking behind them? Rachel. And Rachel, again, is relegated not only to childlessness, but to complete loneliness, because at this point she would have, you understand, at least she had the love of her husband. Walking next to Leah, talking to her, dealing with the children, explain Chazal, says, how can one not love the mother of such children? And so she bears another child, and his name is Yehuda. And by now something has really changed, because she says, Apam odet Hashem. This time I will thank God, because the attitude that he has displayed towards her, their relationship has completely changed, has grown from one of contempt to one of deep affection, clearly. And meanwhile, Rachel is all by herself. Now, not everybody feels so empathetic to her. Adin Steinsaltz, in his article about Rachel, feels that Rachel has the problem of many beautiful people. He sees her as facile. And he writes as follows: she knows she's the beloved one, and more than once she exploits this advantage. In this regard, Rachel symbolizes the failure that can arise from feeling that one is chosen, from feeling entitled, knowing that Yaakov's love is unconditional. Is it really? Is it really? Is that really what she feels? Is this really what's happening to her? That she holds him? Well, I think he's relying on the scene that happens with the Dudaim. And one fine day, Rachel goes out and sees Reuven bringing Dudaim for his mother. He's got this bouquet. Some say it's jasmine. Rashi cites that it's some sort of a lilac flower. Others, I know that in the English it says mandrakes. It's supposed to have some sort of aphrodisiac effect. It's perfume. But it brings a poignancy of a child who sees that his mother's not loved and wants to bring her something, either that indicates that somebody loves her, or that will make her attractive in the eyes of her husband and his father. And Rachel sees this, and she says, no, you give that to me. That's mine. He can sleep with you, but his love is mine. And that's, I believe, where Adin Steinsaltz gets this notion that he has this arrogance of the entitled. The notion that sometimes occurs with people who are very beautiful, that think that they have everything coming to them, since everybody's always oohing and eyeing them. And of course he sleeps, and she tells him, she says, I'll make sure that he goes to you tonight, but you give me those flowers. And she takes her flowers from her. And yet she remains childless. And as Leah continues to have children, Rachel's sympathy for her sister, then her tolerance for her sister, turns to rabid jealousy of her sister. Certainly in certain cultures, where a woman's worth is only based on how many children she can bear and how she raises them, that would have been perhaps the case. What happens then is Rachel confronts her husband in a very dramatic scene in which she demands, Havali banim im ayin meta anochi. Give me sons. If not, I am dead. Now, Rashi here draws the conclusion, we all learned this when we were little. From here we hear that whoever has no children is as good as dead. And that would have been the way, perhaps, certain cultures would have seen it. But the Akedas Yitzchak, Rabbi Yitzchak Arama, writing in the 1300s, has a completely different view. Not that long after Rashi. And he says, Havali banim im ayin meta anochi? How dare she? And justifies Yaakov's response. When Yaakov responds, he says, Hatachat Elokim anochi? Am I in the stead of God that kept you from having children? What do you want from me? It's not my fault. Ramban admonishes him for being insensitive. But the Akedas Yitzchak says, no, she needed a zet zibonkot. It had her coming, she had it coming. How dare she think that if she has no children, she may as well be dead? Ramban says that this was not a sincere threat of suicide, but just the way women would sometimes talk to get the attention. On the contrary, she deems herself worthless because she has no children. And the Akedas Yitzchak says that Yaakov was right to get angry at her. He interprets the phrase, Hatachat Elokim Anochi. He says, what does that make me, a god? If I had no children, he says, would I also be as good as dead? Now, according to Rashi, the answer would be yes. But according to the Akedas Yitzchak, he says, before a woman or a man have children, they have value. After their childbearing age, they have value. It is merely one mitzvah of 613 mitzvahs that were given, and were given to men, not necessarily to a woman. And therefore, the notion somehow that your entire sense of worth comes only from the fact that you actually are fertile is absurd. And that's why he says, what does that make me? He says, a god? Of course not. I'm not the one that withheld. Well, for lack of anything else, of course, she gives him Bilhah, her servant, to serve as a surrogate. And from then we hear how she sees herself. When Bilhah gives birth, she names that child, because remember, though Bilhah has given both the egg, right, as well as the womb, the child is deemed belonging to the mistress. And she names him Dan. Danani Elokim. God judged me. Vegam shama bekoli. But he also heard my voice. Vayiten li ben. And many of the Mefarshim say, when she saw that Yaakov was going to do nothing for her, she decided it's up to her, and she started praying. But to her, God didn't give her children because she was not worthy. She's not good enough. And therefore, she saw this as a judgment against him. But though he judged me and did not give me children, he finally heard my voice. And here we hear for the first time that she's not waiting for him to daven for her. She davened for herself. And she calls him Vayiten li ben. Bilhah has an additional child. And he's called Naphtali. And this time she declares, Naftulei Elokim niftalti machoti gam yacholti. Now this is interpreted in two ways by our sages. Some as the word Elokim being Kodesh. I've wrestled with God, I've wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. In other words, she was angry at God. I don't know why I have this coming to me. It makes no sense. I don't understand this. And struggled with him. She struggled with her sister. And finally she prevailed. She has this second surrogate child, as if she's won somehow. Others treat the word Elokim not that way, but as an adjective. With godlike, mighty wrestling did I wrestle with my sister. And that mighty wrestling with my sister is that love-hate relationship. She cares for her. They've struggled together. They've been through a lot together. And we'll only hear about what they went through much, much later. The two sisters from the same mother with a louse of a father named Lavan. Naftulei Elokim, it means whenever you want to say that something is god-awful bad, you would say, god-awful wrestlings that I wrestle with my sister. It wasn't simple. This was beyond human endurance. but I've prevailed. I've managed somehow to come out of it. I've managed to come out of the rage and the hatred and the jealousy. And only then, only when she's managed to come out of that, are we told that Hashem remembered Rachel, and she became pregnant. And she has a son, who, of course, you know, Vatikra et Shmo Yosef. And as one would speak, as a child would speak to a parent, she adds, Lemo Yosef Hashem li ben Achel. Hitherto, Rachel never referred to God as anything but Elokim, which you all know stands for Midas Hadin. For the first time ever, the name of Havayeh, Shem Hashem, enters her lips as one who no longer sees God as a wrathful, angry, judgmental God, but one who loves her, one who cares for her, one who empathizes and hears her. And as a child who would know that she could go to a parent and say, can I have more? Has a child, names him, and at the very moment of naming says, you know, God, I'd like to have one more. Give me one more. You know, and it sounds a little bit piggish, right? But that kind of piggishness you can only dare do with somebody whom you love, who you've come to understand loves you. Once Yosef is born, Yaakov recognizes that it's time to skedaddle. It's time to go home. And in fact, Hashem appears to him and tells him to do so. But he won't go without speaking to his wives, and he calls them out to the field. Now, there's a good reason why he calls them out to the fields, because the ears have walls. And he tells his wife, I said the walls have ears. Excuse me, the ears have walls. True. Also true. Indeed. And he tells his wives, I've noticed your father. It's not the way it always was. And for the first time we hear mention of Lavan's sons. The Medrash tells us the rest of the story. Namely, that Rachel and Leah's mother died. And Lavan remarries. And this time he doesn't have only 2 daughters, he has sons. They will inherit. And the daughters from the first wife have become, in some respects, chattel, whom he sells for labor. You understand? He will also relate this way to him, because when he chases after Yaakov, you will remember he will say, Habanim, Banai, Habanot, Banotai. The boys are mine, the girls are mine, the daughters are mine, they're all mine. They belong to me. You want to go home, you go home, but you're leaving everybody else behind. In the same way that if a slave had borne children with a maid, the maid and her children belong to the master, and if the slave is freed, he goes off by his own. He has not freed them. But before they actually leave, he calls them, and he tells them as follows. וישלח יעקב ויקרא לרחל וללאה השדה אל צונו. And he says, רואה אני את פני אביכן. I see your father's face. Something here is not right. And meanwhile, אלוקי אבי היה עמדי. My God has appeared to me. Now you know, you both know, he says, how I've worked for your father. And for the first time we hear how he always changed the terms, how he was out with the sheep in the cold of the night, how he suffered in the heat of the summer, how he had cheated him repeatedly again and again. He says, and now it's time for me to leave. Remember that he had also promised Hashem when he had left and had that dream of the ladder, that he would someday return. And then we hear as follows, Vata'an Rachel veLeah. Now the Dikduk should say, Vata'anena. But instead, Rachel now speaks for both of them. The woman who once held her tongue, now let's go. And she tells him, Ha'od lanu chelek v'nachala beveit avinu? You think we have a portion, a lot, any inheritance in the house of our father? You think there's anything holding us here? Halo nochriot necheshavnu lo. He treated us as if we were strangers, as if he had bought us as so many slaves. Kimecharanu, for he sold us. Because in ancient times when somebody took bride money and he loved his daughter, he would take that money and give it to his daughter, which Chazal call nichseitzon ubarzel. That's money that the woman brings into the marriage, and if she's divorced, she takes that money out with her. That money remains her own and never enters into the marital pot. It is hers. That remains her. So parents who love their daughters would ask a high price for her to give the money to the daughter, to give her a measure of security and independence. But instead, what did he do? He sold us. Vayochal gamachol et kaspenu. And he ate up and he doesn't just eat, he flessed our money. What money are we talking about? So Rashi would take the position that he consumed the money he should have given you, which belonged to us, all of us. The Abarbanel says no. They inherited the tzon unichse tzonu barzel. Their mother's dowry, when she died, would have gone to Rachel and Leah. They were her heirs. These were things that were supposed to be hers. And instead, he took that from them and consumed it. So he took whatever they had and sold them for the labor of Yaakov. Ki kol ha'osher asher hitzil Elokim me'avinu lanu hu. All the wealth that my father somehow seems to have accumulated actually belongs to us and to our sons. Ve'ata, whatever, and now, as for now, whatever God says, let's go do it. We're leaving. And they fled. Well, you know the rest of the story. You know that Lavan came chasing after him, and you know that they had all of this negotiation going back and forth, and finally, they make it to Eretz Yisrael after confronting Esav and 400 men. You all remember that. Betwixt and between, Rachel got her wish, and she was pregnant again. But as he was running after them, and prior to leaving, Rachel was not going to be cheated. She'd been cheated and abused long enough. And so she steals her father's trafim. Now, according to some, trafim were idolatry. And so she stole his little household idols. His little Buddhas, his little whatever. Abarbanel takes a different position. He says, we hear the word trafim in the story of Michal and David. We hear that when Michal scurries David away down the window, when his father's out to assassinate him, you remember that she put the trafim in the bed and covered it up so it looked like he was sleeping there. She says what people once did before they had cameras is that they had a beloved, they would make a face mask using wax, and from that they would have a molten image of the beloved, which would then be painted and become a portrait. They had one thing from their mother. The money he had stolen, whatever dowry she had left from them that he had taken, they had nothing left. But she was not going to let this happen. So she went in and stole his trafim, says the Barbanel, It was the family pictures, for lack of anything else. Now, some believed that those trafim, even as family pictures, had a certain power. That power was the power, if you like, to evoke the dead or to tell the future, because it stood for the person who's dead, and those spirits could somehow speak to him. So the Medrash tells us that she stole it so the father would not be able to find out where they are. But the fact of the matter is that he found them, and he caught up with them. And others say, no, she took it because they were hers, and because they'd been taken and abused long enough. At least she was going to leave home with some memento. And hid it. When he accused him of stealing my gods, Yaakov says, nonsense, nobody stole your gods, whoever stole it, and he cursed them. Not knowing, of course, that the one who had stolen them was his beloved Rachel. Rachel playing the role very well. When her father came into her tent, she had hidden them under the saddle of her camel and sat on it and said, you forgive me, Dad, that I don't get up, but I'm indisposed. Pretending at the time that she's menstruating. And whatever a woman sits on when she's menstruating is defiled. And, of course, she wouldn't want to see the mess. And he, of course, left, and this way hid it. She learned how to lie. And she learned how to cheat. And she kept the trafim. They continue on their journey, and her pregnancy continues. And as they cross into Eretz Israel, just a short way away from Bethlehem, Derech Ephrata, she goes into labor and has difficulty birthing. And it goes on for a very long time. And as she's bleeding to death, the midwife tells her, don't worry, it's also a son. And by that you know, before it even came out, that this was a breech delivery. And so she delivers that child even as she's bleeding to death and names him Ben Oni, Aleph, Vav, Nun, Yud. On is one of those words that is an ambivalent word. On can mean koach, strength. But with a non-silent vav, it's an oven, and it means a moral misdeed, a sin. Not quite a crime, but something that is morally reprehensible, something you shouldn't do, an oven. She calls him the son of my sin. And his father changes his name to Binyamin, because the word on can also mean strength, and names him the son of my right hand. In a marvelous article that I read, I have to tell you who the author is, I've got to remember his name. David ben Raphael suggests that this is one of the most romantic scenes. He calls her, she names him son of my sin, because she doesn't want Yaakov to feel guilty of her death. And he names him Binyamin, because when you make an oath, as he made, that he doesn't have the trafim, and whoever has it shall die, he raised his right hand, the son of my oath. Such is the way of lovers. Neither one of them wanted the other one to feel guilty. And he buried her on the side of the road in a place that we know today as Kever Rachel in Bethlehem. She's not buried next to him. Leah is buried next to him. And many years later, he will apologize to her son Yosef, saying, I did what I did not because, and Ramban points this out, the distance between Bethlehem and Hebron is not that much. Others explain it, no, you don't understand. He was traveling with 12 children and a newborn baby and all of the sheep and cattle. He couldn't get to Hebron. No. The Medrash tells us, Asiti et ze al pi hadibur. I did it because so God instructed me. And the reason for that, of course, becomes clear much, much later. Kol berama nishma. Rachel mevaka al baneha. She becomes the matriarch that cries for her children in Galus. And she is the only one that can get God to turn his mind around, if you like. Min'i kolech mi bechi, einayich midima, v'shavu banim ligvulam. Thank you very much.